Hi, I'm still Dave Maynard. Now we're going to talk about the last philosophical argument, and that is the moral argument. And again, in your notes, there is a YouTube video that I really would like you to see before we do the rest of this. So please go over and watch that on YouTube, then come back here and we'll start talking about it. Okay, the moral argument for God's existence is as follows. 1. If objective, absolute moral values exist, then God must exist. We'll explain all that. 2. Objective, absolute moral values do exist. And 3. Therefore, God must exist. Okay, here's how we go about that. How do you explain a sense of morality that is pretty much the same for virtually every person on this planet? Well, you might say, well, it's not the same. Well, they express it differently, but yeah, it is. I don't think there's a culture on this planet that says murder without cause is right, or that rape is right, or that cruelty to anybody is right, brutality to anybody is right. In fact, there's a big thing now in schools about we don't bully. Well, that's the same thing. So why is that? In fact, why should there be a moral sense at all? Some people who say that we've evolved from a single-celled organism, people who believe in evolution, that our morality evolved along with it. Okay. Prove it. What proof is there of that? Absolutely none. And think about it. Are these people really saying that morality has its origins in chemicals and blind chance? If so, then our evolved morality has no objective basis. There's no reason why murder should be wrong. Well, we just evolved that way. Okay, but that's not objective. We could have evolved a different way. Evolutionists like Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, they all believe this. They think that our morality stems from self-preservation that evolution has imbued us with. Now again, there is absolutely no proof of this at all. But they readily concede that they can't explain why people risk their lives to save other people, or why people give blood, or why missionaries devote their life to helping others, or why people minister to sick and dying people, or why Christians teach us to love our enemy. They can't explain that. Well, if you can't explain it, then your theory is lacking. The whole point of morality is that you are doing what you ought to do, not what is in your genes or survival instincts to do. They can't explain where this ought comes from. The Christians explain it by saying God imprinted his moral code into our conscience. Now granted, our conscience can become seared from not listening to God's guiding, but to other people's guidings. And according to the Bible, we are in a fallen state, so our conscience is fallen also. But it's still imprinted with God's morality in there. David Silverman, the president of American Atheists, has said, quote, "There is no objective moral standard. Moral decisions, is a matter of opinion," end quote. Friedrich Nietzsche, the atheist philosopher of the last century, has said that because God doesn't exist, that everything is permitted. Ouch. Fyodor Dostoevsky, in one of his novels, I think it was of Crime and Punishment, says that that if God doesn't exist, then everything is permissible. And that's basically the same thing that Nietzsche said. Now, the difference is Nietzsche was an atheist and Dostoevsky was a Christian. And he was saying, okay, if you're going to say that God doesn't exist, then I'm going to say that then there's no reason we can't do all this stuff. Some people might say, well, wait a minute, you know, you're forcing your views on somebody else and that's wrong. Why is it wrong? There's no reason. Well, we've just decided that. Well, okay, so you expect me to go by your decisions? You're forcing your morals on me? Philosopher Richard Taylor has said, quote, "To say that something is wrong because it is forbidden by God is understandable to anyone who believes in a law-abiding God. But to say that something is wrong without believing in God is not understandable. The concept of moral obligation is unintelligible apart from the idea of God." End quote. Atheist philosopher Michael Roos has said, quote, "Ethics as we understand it is an illusion fobbed off on us by our genes to get us to cooperate. Ethics is a shared illusion of the human race." End quote. The late atheist philosopher William Provine has said, quote, "There's no ultimate foundation for ethics, no ultimate meaning to life, and no free will for humans either." End quote. What did he mean by that last thing? There's no free will for humans either. He means your genes determine what your actions are. You don't determine it by your choice. Your genes are automatically telling you how to react. So you don't have free will. And then there's no ultimate meaning in life. Whether you live or die, irrelevant. Whether you go and commit murder, irrelevant. Whether you go and rape somebody, irrelevant. Now, they also will tell you, well, but you got to have some rules for society, and so we set up those rules and we say we punish you for doing this and we don't punish you for doing that. Okay, but those rules are arbitrary. They're just something a group of people that have agreed to. They can change in time. In fact, they have changed in time. There was a time when abortion was illegal in America. It's not now. There was a time when gay marriage was illegal in America. It's not now. There was a time in part of these United States when black people were not considered to be full people. They are now. There was a time when interracial marriage was considered wrong, at least in the South. It's not now. So we can change our viewpoints. And the problem is each generation feels they're smarter than the last generation. What we don't see is the big picture overall, but that's for another time. So you either believe that morals are absolute, which means they're the same for everybody at all time, or you believe they're relative. That means they're not the same for everybody, and they can change over time. All right, well, let's ask, if they're relative, what do we do when my morals interact with yours? I may believe it's okay to rape your wife. You don't. What happens? And if they are absolute morals, whose absolutes do we use? Do we use mine or do we use yours? The impossibility of denying absolute morals. To deny absolute morals, you have to make an absolute denial, and that's self-contradicting. It's a suicide statement. The example is, I can absolutely state that there are no absolutes. You just shot yourself. There must be an absolute to which all things are relative to. Those who oppose your values will generally replace them with their own. They might say, well, I don't have to abide by your morality, but you should let me do what I want. Well, okay, but eventually that's going to conflict with me, and then what are you going to do? Again, I don't think they really believe morals are relative. They just want to go by their absolutes, not your absolutes. But if morality is relative, well, those who oppose your values will replace them with their own. But if morality is relative, why do that? Who said theirs is better than yours? This would involve judgment against a standard, which relative moralists don't believe in. Do you see the illogic in all this? I mean, it makes your head swim. If morality is not absolute, why teach our children not to lie, or to be kind, or to oppose genocide? Many things are universal as being right or wrong. I've named some of them. Cruelty to children in every generation is like that. Rape in every culture and generation. Murder without cause. Love, respect for others. In fact, there was a sociologist, I believe, I don't have the documentation here right now, but he looked at 100, I think it was 138 moral absolutes that he says are in every culture in every time period. C.S. Lewis also wrote in Mere Christianity that there are universals, or there are absolutes, and here they are. So values or morality don't change greatly from one culture to another, but their expressions do. Now, just because some cultures have values that are different from our culture, it doesn't mean that values are relative. It could mean that some of those values are morally inferior to others. Ooh, I'm making a judgment. Yeah, you're right. Cannibalism is inferior to others. Almost all cultures in all time periods would agree with that. The only ones that wouldn't are the cannibals. Polygamy in a lot of cultures is considered wrong. And you can make a moral case to say, yeah, that polygamy is a moral inferior, is an inferior moral value. When you're talking with somebody like this, here's an acid test, and I don't recommend you doing this unless you really know the person well. But when talking with someone who says that they believe in relative morality, treat them disrespectfully and watch their reaction. They expect you to treat them and their ideas respectfully. What they have done now is established an absolute value that we should treat people with respect. Ouch. I did that one time with somebody. Very predictable reaction. He was offended by the fact that I wasn't respecting him or his values. And I pointed out to him, hey, that's not my morality. That's your morality, but you shouldn't be judging my morality if you say I shouldn't judge yours. And a nation that believes in relative morality would never produce a social reformer like Mother Teresa or Martin Luther King Jr. Why? Well, because that's their morality. They can have their morality, I can have mine, but nobody would ever have to believe them. But if you have some absolute morals, and then somebody comes out and says, hey, these are being violated, and they show you how, that's a very compelling case. Martin Luther King did that with race relations. He came out and said, look, we're all made in God's image. Very biblical. So why don't we have the same rights you have? He was very successful. Mother Teresa went to India, where they feel that what happens, Hinduism, which is the national religion in India, or it's the major religion in India, they feel that if bad things happen to you in this life, they're not going to help you because they figure, hey, you were a schmuck in another life and now you're getting payback. That's what reincarnation teaches. Mother Teresa went over there. She started ministering to these people. It was incredible. And now, here in America, she is held up in very high regard. So, a nation, or even a person that believes in relative morality, they'll never produce a social reformer like those two. Again, how could they? Social reformers always refer to an absolute morality. give you an everyday example. To the person who believes that abortion should be legal, they don't want to live by your absolute values, but they want you to live by theirs. Now, we all have our own set of morals, but let's face it, those morals may change over time. And if those absolutes for us now aren't unchanging and eternal, they're nothing more than relative morality over a longer period of time. That's why you shouldn't believe my absolute morals, or I shouldn't believe your absolute morals, because they might change over time. That's why we need a transcendent or an above humanity source for our morals. That source needs to be eternal and unchangeable. And that's why Christians choose God's morals, because He made us and knows us better than we know ourselves. We don't choose God because He's our God, but because He is the God, the creator of us all. Now, some people might say, yeah, but I don't believe in your God. That doesn't change anything. Ignoring or disagreeing with the truth doesn't make it less true. Sincerity of belief doesn't make your belief true. You can be sincerely wrong. I'm not going to ask for a show of hands, but how many of you thought that your first love was going to be the love of your life? Yeah. And you were wrong, weren't you? You were sincere, but you were wrong. Most people who claim to live by relative morality don't. They just live by another set of absolutes. Everyone lives by some set of absolute morals. The question then becomes, whose set of absolute morals do we live by? That is why the United States Founding Fathers made no bones about whose morals we would accept, and it was the God of the Bible, the Christian God. And if you don't believe me, do some research. Read the book Original Intent by David Barton. Read what the Founding Fathers said about their moral value system. Again, on my website, under famous quotes, I have a ton of quotes from our Founding Fathers and from others that testify to that fact. Our Founding Fathers, their morality was a Christian morality. Now, you don't have to be a Christian to live here, but you had to live under laws that were made under Christian influence. A great example of this is the American and the French Revolutions. Now, the American Revolution happened first. It happened in the 1770s and the early 1780s. It was over by 1783, I believe. The French Revolution happened in the late 1780s and onward. The French Revolution was based on the perfectibility of man, that if you gave man the right social structures, his innate goodness would come out. So they concentrated power into a very few men to help bring this about. Guess what happened? That revolution devolved into the Reign of Terror. Thousands and possibly even hundreds of thousands of French people were killed because they didn't agree with the new morality. It eventually spun way out of control. The country was in complete chaos, and it made it so easy for a guy like Napoleon Bonaparte to come in and promise safety and security, and he became a dictator. Since then, the French have had 8 constitutions. The American Revolution was based on the biblical principle of the imperfectibility of man, or the fact that man was fallen. That's why they diluted power. They didn't give power to just a few men. They diluted power among 3 different branches of government. The executive branch, the president, the congressional branch, that's the House of Representatives and the Senate, and the judicial branch, the Supreme Court. Our systems of checks and balances counteracted this ability of our fallen nature to basically enslave us. You've heard the motto that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That is exactly what the checks and balances have counteracted. Our system of government has lasted for over 200 years under one Constitution. Our Constitution gives us freedom of religion, but it does it under the umbrella of the Christian God. And again, this is said many times in the Declaration of Independence. Yes, it's not mentioned in the Constitution because the Constitution is like an owner's manual. It tells you how to run the government. But if you want to know the basis for forming that government, that's in the Declaration of Independence. No other religions will produce this amount of freedom. They haven't in the past. That is why any other absolute will not allow for the maximum amount of freedom given our fallen nature. Now in John's Gospel, chapter 8, verse 32, and in the book of Romans, chapter 1, verse 25, it talks about that. That is why many people feel that Jesus has given us the highest ethical teaching ever in the history of the world. Even many unbelievers acknowledge this. And it's really crazy when you think this guy was born in an obscure village in an obscure nation of the Roman Empire, but he only had ministry for 3 years. And those 3 years have produced an earthquake in humanity's existence. Consider the following points. First off, A, don't consider morals, or don't confuse morals with their expressions. Example, Hindus don't eat meat. Christians do. But why don't Hindus eat meat? Because of their belief in reincarnation. They believe if you eat meat, you could be eating your deceased Aunt Mary. She could have become, when she died, she could have become reincarnated as a cow. Both Christians and Hindus believe you shouldn't eat your deceased Aunt Mary, or you shouldn't engage in cannibalism. We just express it differently. So don't confuse morality with the expression of it. B, without an objective moral standard that doesn't change, you couldn't say that something like murder is always wrong. You could only say it's not your preference, or it's against the agreed upon rules that a group of your people have set, but if you work hard enough, you could also change those rules. C, we shouldn't deny absolute moral values just because we have trouble knowing the answer in a few difficult situations. And I'll admit, there are some difficult situations. We should also realize that moral values are a hierarchy. Yes, lying is wrong, but is it always wrong? No. In Germany in World War II, if you were housing Jews, lying about that would not be wrong. Why? Because the higher moral value is you're protecting human life. D, Princeton University professor and Darwinist Peter Singer has used Darwinism to assert that, quote, the life of a newborn baby is of less value than the life of a pig, a dog, or a chimpanzee, end quote. Yeah, he really said that, and he really believes that. In fact, he believes parents should be able to kill their newborn babies for 28 days after they're born. The immediate question pops to my mind is, why 28 days? What's the difference between 28 days and 2 years? And other people now are saying 2 years. They're saying you should be able to kill your kid if they're 2 years or under. Unbelievable. Unbelievable. E, James Rachels, who is the author of the book Created from Animals, The Moral Implications of Darwinism, says that because we humans are animals, that we could be used as laboratory subjects for experiments, or even as food for other people or other animals. Shades of the 1970s movie Soylent Green. Oh my goodness. Can you believe an educated person would say something like that? F. The experiments that the Nazis did on humans, which were horrific, they can't really be condemned by Darwinists, because from the Nazi point of view, they were trying to better their race by doing these experiments on other people. If you're going to be a consistent Darwinist. G. Consistent Darwinist can only consider murder or rape as personal dislikes, not as real moral wrongs. And H, in real life, most people do believe in objective, absolute moral standards. They just haven't thought it through enough to be able to articulate it. But they do. As before, I've given you some reference books to check out that talk about this in much greater detail and with much more examples. And I've also given you some websites for it. Okay? Okay, that's it. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.